The notification light on the iPhone blinked once. A soft, harmless pulse against the dark mahogany of the dining table. It was the kind of silence that usually signaled the end of a long day in a high-rise overlooking the Chicago skyline, until the screen lit up with a message that should have never been written, let alone sent. Staying overnight with my first love. 7 words that didn't just end a marriage. They incinerated the past 10 years in a single second. If you find yourself drawn to the quiet moments before a storm destroys everything, stick around, because we are just opening the door to the wreckage. The rain in Chicago had a way of turning the city into a blur of charcoal and steel, a visual that usually soothed Daniel Vance. From the 42nd floor of the Sterling Tower, the world below was nothing but a silent grid of moving lights. Inside, the apartment was perfectly temperature-controlled, smelling faintly of teak wood and expensive scotch. Daniel sat in his Eames chair, a set of blueprints spread across his lap. He was a man who appreciated structure. In his architecture, he believed that if the foundation was flawed, no amount of aesthetic decoration could save the building. He applied the same logic to his life. His phone sat on the marble side table, face up. It was 11:14 p.m. Elena was in New York. The college reunion. He hadn't wanted her to go, though he hadn't said it aloud. There was a restlessness in her lately, a frantic energy that made her pace their living room like a trapped animal. She spoke often of lost time and paths not taken, phrases that Daniel cataloged as warning signs, but chose to ignore in favor of keeping the peace. He took a sip of the scotch, the liquid amber burning pleasantly in his throat. He was about to turn the page of his book when the screen of his phone lit up. The buzz was singular, short. He glanced over. A message preview from Elena. Daniel reached for the phone, expecting a complaint about the hotel or perhaps a late-night update about how everyone from the class of 2005 had aged terribly. He unlocked the screen. The message was not a complaint. It was not an update. It was a confession, though he suspected it wasn't meant for him. Elena, I can't stop shaking. I know it's wrong, but I'm staying overnight with my first love. Don't wait up. Daniel stared at the pixels. He read the sentence once, then twice. He checked the recipient. It was definitely his thread. She had likely meant to text Clara, her sister and eternal confidant, the enabler of her chaotic impulses. For a long moment, the only sound in the penthouse was the hum of the refrigerator and the distant, muffled wind battering the glass. Most men would have felt a surge of adrenaline, a spike of heat in the chest, a scream rising in the throat. Daniel felt none of that. Instead, he felt a strange, cold clarity, like the snap of a measuring tape retracting into its case. He looked at the timestamps. She had texted him "Good night, love you" 2 hours ago. That was the lie. This text at 11:14 p.m. was the truth. Staying overnight with my first love, he whispered to the empty room. He didn't know who the man was. He didn't care. The name didn't matter. The breach of contract did. The foundation had cracked. The building was condemned. Daniel set the glass of scotch down on a coaster. He didn't throw the phone against the wall. He didn't type a furious response in all caps. He didn't call her to demand an explanation or to hear her stammer out a lie about autocorrect. He simply stood up and walked to the primary bedroom. He pulled his Toomey suitcase from the top shelf of the walk-in closet. He opened it on the bed they had purchased together in Italy 3 years ago, and began to pack. He moved with the efficiency of a man conducting an evacuation drill. 3 suits, 7 shirts, his grooming kit, his passport, the hard drive containing his current project files. He walked to the wall safe, punched in the code, and removed his birth certificate, the deed to the summer house, and his watch collection. At 11:35 p.m. his phone buzzed again. Elena. Oh my God. Daniel. Ignore that. That was a joke. A stupid dare. Please call me. Then another. Elena. Daniel? And another. Elena. Pick up. Please. Daniel looked at the desperate pleading on the screen. He felt a phantom twinge of pity, distant and small, like looking at a stranger crying on the subway. She was panicking not because she had hurt him, but because she had been caught. He opened his banking app. He transferred the entirety of the liquid assets from their joint checking account into his personal holding LLC, a move his lawyer had advised him to prepare for 6 months ago, just in case. He hadn't wanted to believe he would ever need to use that failsafe. He confirmed the transfer. Then, he opened the smart home app. He selected the Security tab. He found the user profile labeled Elena. His finger hovered over the red trash can icon. Reaction changed everything, he murmured, recalling something she had once said about how he never reacted to anything with enough emotion. He tapped delete. He tapped confirm. The digital key to the penthouse was now invalid. Daniel zipped up his suitcase. He put on his coat, grabbed his phone, and walked out of the apartment, leaving the lights on and the half-finished scotch on the table. He didn't look back. When he got into the elevator, he finally replied. 2 words. Daniel. Have fun. Then he blocked her number. The morning sun over Central Park was not gentle. It was an interrogation lamp. It sliced through the gap in the heavy velvet curtains of the hotel suite, landing directly on Elena's face. She groaned, rolling over, the silk sheets tangled around her legs like a trap. Her head throbbed with the specific, dull rhythm of expensive champagne consumed too quickly and too late. For a few seconds, she was suspended in the blissful ignorance of waking up. She was just Elena in New York, tired but safe. Then memory returned. It didn't come in a flood, but in a single freezing drop that landed in the center of her chest. The text. Elena sat up, ignoring the wave of nausea that rolled through her stomach. She scrambled for her phone on the nightstand. It was sitting there, innocent and black, plugged into the charger. Her hand trembled so badly, she fumbled the passcode twice. She opened the messaging app. The thread with Daniel was at the top. The timestamp of her last message was 11:14 p.m. Staying overnight with my first love. Don't wait up. It wasn't a nightmare. It was there, blue and terrifying, permanently etched into the digital record of their marriage. And below it, his response delivered 21 minutes later. 2 words that felt colder than any scream. Have fun. No, 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 Elena whispered, her voice cracking. The room was silent. The other side of the bed was empty. Julian had left hours ago, slipping out before dawn, a coward's exit that seemed romantic last night, but felt cheap in the harsh light of day. She typed furiously, Daniel, please, I'm awake, I'm so sorry. It was a misunderstanding. Call me. She hit send. The bubble appeared. It sat there for a second, then turned green instead of blue. Sent as text message. No delivered receipt. She tried to call him. The phone didn't even ring. It went straight to the automated voicemail, the robotic voice sounding jarringly cheerful. The customer you are calling is unavailable. He had blocked her. Daniel, the man who answered her calls during board meetings, who had never once let her go to voicemail in 7 years, had blocked her. Panic began to constrict her throat. She needed to get home. She needed to stand in front of him, to cry, to explain that Julian was just a ghost from the past, that nothing physical had happened, or at least nothing that couldn't be forgiven. She needed to make him see her. She opened the airline app to change her flight. Her fingers flew across the screen, adrenaline overriding the hangover. She found a seat on the 11 o'clock a.m. flight to O'Hare. It was exorbitant, last minute, first class, but she didn't care. She selected the card on file, the Platinum Amex they shared. Processing. The wheel spun for an agonizingly long time. Error. Transaction declined. Please contact your financial institution. Elena stared at the screen. That card had a limit that could buy a small house. She tried again. Declined. She switched to the joint visa. Declined. A cold sweat broke out on the back of her neck. This wasn't a glitch. Daniel was a man of precision. He didn't break things. He dismantled them. She remembered the way he dealt with contractors who failed to meet safety standards. Calm, legal, and absolute termination. She opened her mobile banking app. Face ID let her in, but the dashboard looked wrong. The joint savings and household operations accounts, the ones holding the bulk of their liquidity, were gone. Vanished. The only account visible was her personal checking account, the one she barely used, which contained less than $3,000. He hadn't just left her. He was starving her out. She threw the phone onto the duvet and stood up, pacing the room. The luxury of the suite suddenly felt oppressive, the high ceilings mocking her smallness. She looked at her reflection in the large gilt mirror. She looked wrecked. Mascara smeared beneath her eyes, hair matted, wearing a hotel robe that suddenly felt like a prison uniform. She grabbed the hotel landline. She knew his office number by heart. "Vance Architecture, how may I direct your call?" the receptionist asked, her voice professional and crisp. "It's Elena," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Put me through to Daniel. It's an emergency." There was a pause that lasted too long. The silence stretched, filled with the faint static of the line. "Mrs. Vance," the receptionist said, her tone shifting. It wasn't rude, but it was guarded. The warmth was gone. "Mr. Vance is in meetings all day. He left strict instructions not to be disturbed." "I am his wife," Elena snapped, her control fraying. "Put him on." "I'm sorry, ma'am. I can't do that." The line went dead. Elena slowly hung up the receiver. She looked around the room, at the empty champagne bottle on the desk, at the unmade bed where she had tried to reclaim her youth with Julian. She realized then that she hadn't just made a mistake. She had triggered a mechanism she didn't even know existed. Daniel wasn't waiting for an apology. He was already gone. She needed to get out of this room. She needed to get back to Chicago before the locks changed, if they hadn't already. The flight from LaGuardia to O'Hare was a blur of claustrophobia and turbulence. Elena sat in seat 34B, sandwiched between a sleeping teenager and a businessman aggressively typing on a laptop. She had scraped together the last of her available cash, an emergency stash she kept in her makeup bag, to pay for a one-way economy ticket. It was a humbling descent from the first-class cabin she usually occupied. a physical manifestation of her rapidly shrinking world. She stared out the oval window at the gray expanse of clouds, her phone clutched in her hand like a talisman. She had tried calling Daniel 3 more times before takeoff. Each time, the call failed instantly. He wasn't just ignoring her. He had erected a digital firewall. When the taxi pulled up to the curb of the Sterling Tower, the Chicago wind was whipping off the lake, carrying needles of sleet that stung her cheeks. The building rose into the slate sky, a monolith of glass and steel that Daniel had not designed, but had chosen for its uncompromising verticality. It had always felt like a fortress. Now, standing on the sidewalk with her weekend bag, it looked like a weapon. Elena paid the driver with the last of her cash, not waiting for change. She hurried toward the entrance, head ducked against the cold, seeking the warmth of the lobby. She reached into her purse and pulled out her key fob. It was a small, heavy rectangle of brushed steel, engraved with her initials, E.V. She had always loved the weight of it. She pressed it against the black sensor panel next to the revolving doors. Usually, there was a soft, affirmative chirp and a green light. Instead, the machine emitted a low, dissonant buzz. A small red LED blinked once, slowly, like a closing eye. Elena frowned, her heart stuttering. She wiped the sleet off the sensor with her sleeve and pressed the fob again. Buzz. Red light. "Come on!" she hissed, panic rising in her chest. She pressed it a third time, harder, as if force could override the code. Buzz. Inside the lobby, through the thick, soundproof glass, she saw movement. Henry, the daytime concierge who had worked at the Sterling for 20 years, stepped out from behind the marble desk. Henry was a man of discretion, someone who had sent up flowers for her birthday and arranged dry cleaning for Daniel's suits. He had always greeted her with a warm smile and a, "Welcome home, Mrs. Vance." Today, he did not smile. He walked toward the glass doors, his gait slow, hesitant. He didn't press the release button to let her in. Instead, he pushed the manual door open just a crack, blocking the gap with his body. The warm air from the lobby rushed out, smelling of expensive lilies and floor wax, hitting Elena's frozen face. "Henry," Elena said, breathless, reaching for the handle. "Thank God. My fob isn't working. It must be demagnetized or something. I need to get upstairs. I'm freezing." Henry didn't move. He was a man in his 60s, with kind eyes that currently looked pained. He looked over Elena's shoulder at the street, then back at her face, avoiding direct eye contact. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice quiet. "I can't let you up." Elena froze. The wind whipped her hair across her face. "What? Henry, it's me. Elena, I live here." "Mr. Vance, he updated the security protocols this morning," Henry said, the words clearly rehearsed. "Access to the penthouse is restricted to the primary leaseholder only." "I am a leaseholder!" Elena's voice rose, cracking with hysteria. "I am his wife!" "I'm truly sorry," Henry said again. He reached into the inside pocket of his uniform blazer. "Mr. Vance left this for you. He instructed me to hand it to you if you arrived." He extended a thick manila envelope. Elena stared at it. It was sealed with the precision Daniel applied to everything. No tape, just the clean fold of the clasp. She didn't want to take it. Taking it felt like accepting the terms of a surrender she hadn't agreed to. "I'm not taking that," she said, trembling. "I'm going up to my apartment." "Mrs. Vance, please," Henry pleaded gently. "Don't make me call security. You know the policy." The threat hung in the cold, Air. Security. The idea that she, Elena Vance, who had hosted galas in that penthouse, would be escorted off the premises like a trespasser was too much to process. Defeated, she reached out and snatched the envelope. Henry looked relieved but sorrowful. "Take care, ma'am." He stepped back and let the heavy glass door click shut. The lock engaged with a decisive thud. Elena stood alone on the sidewalk. The sleet was turning to snow now, large wet flakes that melted on her coat. She looked down at the envelope in her hand. It felt light. Too light to contain an explanation. She tore it open with numbness in her fingers. Inside there was no letter, no handwritten note of anger, no divorce papers. Not yet. There was a single key card for the Palmer House Hilton and a small, typed index card. "Room 412 is paid for 3 nights. Do not come back here." That was it. No signature, just the instruction. Elena looked up at the 42nd floor. The lights were off. The building was a monolith of silence, and for the first time in 10 years, she was completely on the outside. The conference room at Thorne and Bradley was designed to intimidate. Located on the 55th floor, 13 stories above Daniel's penthouse, it offered a view of the city that reduced Chicago to a silent, geometric model. The table was a slab of black granite, cold to the touch, stretching out like a runway. Elena sat at one end, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to stop them from shaking. She was wearing the same clothes she had worn on the flight yesterday, a wrinkled cashmere sweater and jeans that felt far too casual for the sterile, corporate air of the room. She had spent the night at the Palmer House staring at the ceiling, waiting for a call that never came. Instead, at 8:00 a.m., a courier had delivered a summons to this office. The heavy oak door opened. Daniel did not walk in. Instead, Marcus Thorne entered. He was Daniel's personal attorney, a man Elena had hosted at dinner parties, a man who had once toasted to their eternal happiness with a glass of vintage Pinot Noir. Today, he wore a charcoal suit that cost more than her car, and his face was stripped of all social pleasantries. "Elena," Marcus said. It wasn't a greeting. It was an acknowledgement of presence. He didn't offer his hand. He walked to the head of the table, sat down, and placed a thick, leather-bound binder in front of him. "Where is he, Marcus?" Elena asked, her voice thin. "I need to speak to my husband." "Daniel is not available," Marcus replied smoothly, opening the binder. "And as of this morning, all communication regarding the dissolution of your marriage will go through me." Dissolution. The word hung in the air, clinical and violent. "Marcus, I sent a stupid text. A drunken, meaningless text. I didn't sleep with anyone. I came home. This is insane." Marcus looked up, his expression mild, almost bored. He slid a single sheet of paper across the granite. It was a photocopy of the text message. "Staying overnight with my first love." "The text," Marcus said, "is merely the exhibit that accelerated the timeline. It is not the cause." Elena frowned. "What are you talking about?" "Daniel is a man of structure, Elena. You know that better than anyone. He doesn't make impulsive decisions based on a single emotional outlier." Marcus tapped the binder. "We have been preparing this file for 11 months. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. 11 months? Daniel felt the distance. He noted the withdrawal of affection, the separate vacations, the increasing mentions of your lost potential. He realized the marriage had become a liability to his peace of mind. Marcus turned a page. He was waiting for a breach of contract, a definitive reason to execute the exit strategy that wouldn't result in a protracted public battle. He slid another document across the table. It was a printout of her credit card statement from 6 months ago, a dinner for two at a bistro in the West Village, a trip she had claimed was a solo gallery tour. "He knew you were unhappy," Marcus continued, his voice devoid of judgment. "He knew you were looking for a way out. He simply decided to be prepared for when you finally found it." Elena stared at the papers. She felt a wave of nausea. She had thought she was the one harboring secrets, the one struggling with the weight of unsaid things. But all this time, while she was pacing the living room feeling trapped, Daniel had been watching her. He hadn't been fighting for her. He had been building a case against her. "The text regarding your first love constitutes an admission of intent to commit adultery," Marcus said, closing the binder. "Under the morality clause of your prenuptial agreement, which I drafted, if you recall, this severely limits your claim to the estate. Daniel is generous, however. He is offering a lump sum settlement to avoid court." He pushed a final document forward. A check. It was for a significant amount, enough to start over, but a fraction of the life she had just lost. "He wants you to sign today," Marcus said. "He wants the keys returned. He wants the divorce finalized by the end of the month." Elena looked at the check, then at the empty chair where her husband should have been. She realized then that the text hadn't destroyed Daniel. It had given him exactly what he wanted. A clean, justifiable reason to cut her loose. "He never loved me," she whispered, the realization hurting more than the divorce itself. "He just managed me." Marcus stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. "Daniel builds things to last, Elena," he said, buttoning his jacket. "When a structure becomes unstable, he doesn't patch it, he demolishes it." The wind on Wacker Drive felt less like weather and more like a physical assault. Elena stepped out of the revolving doors of Thorne and Bradley, the check for the settlement burning a hole in her purse. It was a staggering amount of money to most people, but to her, it felt like severance pay. It was the price tag Daniel had placed on 7 years of shared history, calculated down to the cent, devoid of any sentimental markup. She walked back to the Palmer House Hilton, her head bowed against the gale. The city she had lived in for a decade suddenly felt foreign. Without the filter of the penthouse windows or the security of the town car, Chicago was just a loud, cold place full of strangers who didn't care that her life had been dismantled in less than 24 hours. Back in room 412, she kicked off her heels and sat on the edge of the bed. The silence of the hotel room was suffocating. She needed noise. She needed passion. She needed to be reminded that she wasn't just a liability or a failed investment, as Marcus Thorne's binder had implied. She was a woman who had been desired enough to risk everything. She needed Julian. If Daniel was the cold, unyielding steel of a skyscraper, Julian was the fire. He was the reason she was in this mess. Yes. But he was also the justification. If she could anchor herself to him, then none of this was a tragedy. It was a romance. It was a story of star-crossed lovers finding their way back to each other against the odds. She pulled out her phone. Her hands were shaking. But this time, it was with a desperate sort of hope. She dialed his number. It rang 4 times. Then 5. "Hello?" Julian's voice was breathless, loud, competing with the thrum of bass-heavy music in the background. "Julian," Elena said, her voice cracking. "It's me." Elena, hey! He shouted, the sound of glass clinking against glass filtering through the line. I thought you were on a plane. Or in a meeting? Did you get back to the ivory tower? I'm in Chicago, she said, clutching the phone tighter. But I'm not home. I'm at a hotel. A hotel? Trouble in paradise? He laughed, a rough, carefree sound that usually made her smile. Today, it grated on her nerves. Daniel knows, she said. She didn't have the energy to sugarcoat it. I sent the text to him, by accident. He knows everything. There was a pause on the line. The background music seemed to swell, filling the silence. Whoa, Julian said finally. The laughter was gone, replaced by a wary tone. Everything like everything? He kicked me out, Julian. He changed the locks. He had a file on me. He's filing for divorce. Elena let the words tumble out, waiting for him to interrupt, to tell her to fly back to New York, to tell her that this was the sign they had been waiting for. Shit, Elena, that's intense. He sounded distracted. She heard him say something to someone else in the room. Hold on, babe, give me a sec. Elena froze. Julian, are you alone? I'm at the studio. Just some people hanging out, he said, dismissive. So he kicked you out? Just like that? Did he cut you off? Why does that matter? Elena asked, a cold knot forming in her stomach. I'm just asking, Elle. Practicalities. You know how these rich guys are. They like to scorch the earth. He gave me a settlement, she whispered, feeling dirty for even mentioning it. He wants me to sign and disappear. Well, Julian's voice brightened slightly. That's good, right? Freedom Capital. You can finally do what you want. You can paint again. We can, figure things out. The phrase figure things out hung in the air, flimsy and weak. It wasn't come home to me. It wasn't I love you. It was the non-committal shrug of a man who enjoyed the drama of an affair, but had no interest in the architecture of a relationship. I gave up my life, Julian, she said, her voice trembling. I am sitting in a hotel room with nothing because I wanted to be with you. Hey, slow down, Julian said, his tone shifting to defensive. You said you were unhappy. You said he was a robot. Don't put this all on me, Elena. I didn't tell you to text him. The line went silent again, save for the thumping bass. In that silence, the illusion flickered and died. She remembered the nights in college, the unpredictability she had romanticized as passion. She realized now that it wasn't passion. It was just instability. Daniel had built walls to protect her. Julian wouldn't even turn down the music to hear her cry. You're right, Elena said, her voice hollow. You didn't tell me. Look, let's talk later, okay? When you're less hysterical. Come back to New York next week. We'll get a drink. We'll celebrate your freedom. Celebrate, she repeated. Yeah. It's a new beginning, babe. Gotta embrace the chaos. Elena ended the call. She lowered the phone and looked at the black screen. The first love she had texted about, the man she had thrown a grenade into her marriage for, wasn't a savior. He was just a boy who hadn't grown up, looking for a good time and a funded accomplice. She looked at the check again. Daniel's signature was sharp, angular, precise. He had known. He had known exactly who she was, and exactly who Julian was. He hadn't fought for her because he knew, with his terrifying architect's foresight, that she would eventually see the cracks in the foundation herself. But he hadn't waited for her to see it. He had just closed the door. Elena curled up on the hotel bed, fully clothed, and for the first time since the text, she didn't cry for Daniel. She cried for her own devastating stupidity. 6 weeks later, the air in the Aura Gallery was thin, conditioned to preserve the oil paintings and the brittle composure of the guests. It was the opening of a minimalist retrospective, the kind of event Elena would have once commanded with a glass of champagne in one hand and a donor list in the other. Tonight, she stood near a stark white pillar, gripping a glass of sparkling water, feeling less like a director and more like an exhibit on display. She had signed the papers 3 days ago. The settlement was finalized. The divorce was quietly moving through the courts, sealed and sanitized. But she hadn't seen him. Not once. Until now. The heavy glass doors at the front of the gallery opened, admitting a gust of wind and a man in a navy trench coat. Daniel. The room didn't go silent. The chatter of the socialites and critics continued. But for Elena, the sound dropped away completely. She watched him hand his coat to the Czech girl. He smiled, a genuine, polite curving of the lips that she hadn't seen directed at her in years. He looked infuriatingly good. He wasn't the haggard, heartbroken husband she had secretly hoped to see. He looked lighter. His shoulders, usually tight with the tension of his work, were relaxed. He wore a charcoal suit she didn't recognize, something new, purchased in a life she was no longer part of. Elena felt a surge of nausea mixed with a desperate magnetic pull. She needed him to look at her. She needed to see something in his eyes. Regret, anger, even hate. Anything was better than the silence of the last month. She stepped away from the pillar, moving through the crowd. She intercepted him near a sculpture made of twisted iron. "Daniel," she said. He stopped. He turned slowly, not with a start, but with the measured grace of someone who had anticipated this variable. "Elena," he said. His voice was calm, pitched low enough to be private but loud enough to be polite. "You look well." "I look well?" She let out a short, incredulous laugh. "That's what you have to say? After 6 weeks? After you locked me out of my life in 20 minutes? Daniel took a sip of his drink. He glanced at the sculpture, then back at her. His eyes were clear, devoid of the fatigue that used to plague him. "I didn't think this was the place for a post-mortem, Elena." "There was never a place," she hissed, stepping closer. "You didn't give me a chance to speak. You just erased me. Was I that easy to discard? Was 10 years worth nothing more than a text message?" She wanted him to yell. She wanted him to cause a scene. Instead, Daniel sighed. It wasn't a sigh of frustration. It was a sigh of pity. "It wasn't the text, Elena," he said softly. "Then what was it? The first love thing? It was a joke. It was a stupid, drunken nostalgia trip. Julian means nothing." "I know Julian means nothing," Daniel said. "And I know the text was a mistake. But when I read it, when I saw those words on the screen..." He paused, looking at her with a terrifyingly clinical honesty. "I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel jealous." He tilted his head slightly. "I felt relieved." The word hit her harder than a slap. Relieved. "Relieved?" she whispered. "I had been waiting," Daniel admitted. "For months, maybe years. We were just occupying the same square footage, Elena. We were polite. We were functional. But we were dead. I was exhausted from trying to keep the structure standing, when the foundation was gone. When you sent that text, it was like you finally signed the demolition permit I couldn't bring myself to file. Elena stared at him. The narrative she had built, that she was the victim of a ruthless, cold man, crumbled. He wasn't ruthless. He was just done. He had been done for a long time. You didn't leave because I betrayed you, she realized, her voice trembling. You left because you wanted to go. I left because you wanted to be somewhere else, Daniel corrected gently. And frankly, so did I. He checked his watch. A new Patek Philippe, she noted absently. I have to go, he said. Take care of yourself, Elena. Use the settlement well. He didn't touch her. He didn't offer a handshake. He simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of art lovers and critics. Elena stood alone next to the twisted iron sculpture. The gallery was warm, but she felt a chill that settled deep in her bones. She realized then that hate wasn't the opposite of love. Indifference was. And Daniel Vance was the most indifferent man she had ever known. The radiator in the new apartment hissed, a sharp, rhythmic sound that Elena was slowly learning to ignore. It was a pre-war one-bedroom in Lincoln Park, charming to a college student perhaps, but to a woman who had spent the last decade in climate-controlled silence, it felt like living inside a machine. Elena sat on the floor, surrounded by half-packed boxes. The settlement money was substantial, yes, but it wasn't infinite. Without Daniel's investment portfolio and the unspoken perks of the Vance name, the cost of living in Chicago had suddenly become very real. She had chosen this place for its anonymity. Here there were no doormen who knew her schedule, no neighbors who read the society pages. She slit the tape on a box labeled Books Office. Inside were the glossy art catalogs she had collected over the years. On top lay a copy of Chicago Magazine. She hadn't bought it. It had been forwarded in her mail, a cruel accident of a subscription she forgot to cancel. She stared at the cover. There was Daniel. He was standing on a construction site, wearing a hard hat and a bespoke wool coat, pointing at a steel girder rising into the sky. The headline read, Vance Architecture wins bid for the new Millennium Spire. Elena felt a hollow ache in her chest. It wasn't the jealousy of a lover. It was the envy of a ghost watching the living. While she was taping up cardboard boxes and arguing with the cable company, Daniel was reshaping the skyline. He was building. He was expanding. She opened the magazine. The article described him as a visionary of functional solitude. It mentioned his focus, his renewed energy. It didn't mention her. There was no line saying, despite a recent divorce. It was as if she had never existed in his narrative at all. The divorce hadn't been a hurdle for him. It had been a structural renovation. Elena closed the magazine and pushed it aside. She stood up and walked to the window. The view was of a brick alleyway and a fire escape, a far cry from the panoramic lake views of the penthouse. Her phone buzzed on the windowsill. For a moment, instinct kicked in. A flicker of hope that it might be an invitation, a friend checking in. But her phone had been quiet for weeks. The social circles of Chicago's elite were concentric and tight. When she was expelled from the center, the outer rings had closed ranks. The women she used to brunch with, the board members she had charmed, they had all drifted away, offering polite, vague excuses before fading into silence. They were Daniel's friends, really. She was just the accessory that had malfunctioned. She checked the screen. It was a notification from Instagram. Julian posted a new photo. Elena stared at the name. Julian. The first love. The catalyst. She tapped the notification. The photo was of Julian in a loft in Brooklyn, holding a beer, his arm draped around a girl with dyed pink hair. The caption read, "New Muse, New Chaos. Art Life." Elena looked at the girl. She looked young, messy, and vividly alive. Everything Elena had tried to be for one night in a hotel room. She didn't feel heartbroken. She didn't feel a surge of longing. She felt embarrassed. She realized with a crushing clarity that she had torched her life not for a great passion, but for a cliché. She had mistaken the boredom of stability for a cage, and the immaturity of the past for freedom. Julian hadn't been waiting for her. He was just living his same chaotic loop, and she had briefly stepped into it, thinking it was a destination. "You idiot," she whispered to the empty room. She went to her contacts list. She scrolled down to Julian. She didn't text him goodbye. She didn't ask for an explanation. There was nothing to explain. He was exactly who he had always been. She was the one who had projected a fantasy onto him. She pressed delete contact. The silence in the apartment seemed to deepen. The radiator hissed again. Elena walked to the small kitchenette. She filled a kettle with water. It was 7:00 p.m. on a Tuesday. In her old life, she would be dressed for a dinner at Gibson's or hosting a committee meeting. Now she was making tea in a mug that didn't match anything else. She took a sip, the hot liquid burning her tongue. It hurt, but it was real. She looked around the small, cluttered living room. It was terrifyingly small. But for the first time in months, it was honest. There were no secrets here, no hidden resentments, no perfectly curated lies. She had lost the penthouse. She had lost the status. She had lost the husband who fixed everything. But as she looked at the magazine on the floor, Daniel's face looking toward the future, she realized she had also lost the fear of being found out. The worst had happened. The building had collapsed, and she was, somehow, still standing in the rubble. The Chicago winter had returned, completing the cycle. The wind off the lake was just as sharp as it had been the night Elena stood outside the Sterling Tower, with a manila envelope in her hand. But this time, she was prepared for it. She wrapped her wool scarf tighter around her neck as she walked down the sidewalk of her neighborhood in Lincoln Square. It was a different part of the city. Here, the buildings were brick, not glass. The sounds were of families and local traffic, not the hushed, sterile hum of high-finance limousines. Elena shifted the tote bag on her shoulder. Inside were flyers for the community art class she was teaching on Tuesdays. It wasn't the prestigious gallery director role she had once held, and the pay was negligible compared to her old allowance. But the work was tangible. When her students mixed paint, their hands got dirty. It felt real. She stopped at a small coffee shop on the corner, ordering a latte with oat milk. She paid with her own debit card. There was no hesitation, no fear of a declined transaction, no shadow of a husband monitoring the statement. She sat at a small wooden table by the window, watching the snow flurry outside. She pulled out her phone to check the time. A notification from LinkedIn popped up. Suggested connection. Daniel Vance. The algorithm, devoid of human context, didn't know they were divorced. It only knew they had shared a network for a decade. Elena hesitated. Her thumb hovered over the screen. For months, she had blocked him, muted him, avoided any digital trace of his existence. But today, the anniversary of the text was approaching. The fear that used to grip her, The shame of being the discarded wife felt distant, like a scar that had finally faded to white. She tapped the profile. It wasn't just a profile update. It was a shared article from Architectural Digest, posted 2 hours ago. The thumbnail showed Daniel. He was standing in the finished lobby of the Millennium Spire, the project that had consumed him during their last year together. But he wasn't alone. Standing next to him was a woman. She wasn't a 20-something model. She looked to be his age, perhaps 40, with laugh lines around her eyes and messy, curly hair that defied the rigid geometry of Daniel's architecture. She was wearing a simple coat, and she was looking at Daniel, not the camera. And Daniel was looking back at her. Elena zoomed in on the photo. There was an expression on Daniel's face that Elena recognized, but not from their marriage. It was the look he used to give a finished building, a look of complete, satisfied stability. But this time it was directed at a person. He looked safe. He looked unburdened. He looked like a man who didn't have to constantly shore up a crumbling foundation. Elena stared at the image for a long time. The coffee shop bustled around her, the hiss of the espresso machine, the laughter of 2 students at the next table. But she sat in a quiet pocket of clarity. A year ago, she had sent a text that she thought was the worst mistake of her life. Staying overnight with my first love. She had thought that text destroyed her marriage. But looking at Daniel now, smiling at a woman who clearly didn't require him to be a fortress, Elena realized the truth. The text hadn't destroyed the marriage. The marriage had been a hollow shell, standing only because they were both too polite to knock it down. The text was just the wrecking ball. It had been violent. It had been humiliating. It had cost her the penthouse, the status, and the illusion of safety. But it had also given her this. A cup of coffee she paid for herself, a job where she felt useful, a small, drafty apartment that didn't judge her, and the freedom to stop pretending she was someone else's perfect wife. She looked at the photo one last time. She didn't feel angry. She didn't feel the urge to throw the phone. She felt a strange, quiet gratitude. "You're welcome," she whispered softly to the screen. She closed the app. She didn't block him this time. She didn't need to. He was just a character in a story she had finished reading. Elena finished her coffee, stood up, and walked out into the cold, clean air of the Chicago afternoon. The snow was falling harder now, covering the gray pavement in a fresh, white sheet, ready for new footprints.